Alright, I'm going to create a chessboard, and there are a few notes below. I want to write a string that produces an 8 by 8 grid. I'm going to pass that string to console.log and separate lines with new line characters. Each position of the grid will either be filled with an empty space or a hashtag character. And I want to define a variable. I'm going to name that variable size and set it equal to 8. However, I want to write the program so that if I change the value for that variable size, then the entire grid will change with it. So I'm going to actually just get started by creating a for loop. And I'm going to name the counter variable I. I'll set it equal to 0 and end the statement. And now I'm going to check that condition by saying, as long as I is less than or equal to 8, run through this for loop, I'll end the statement. And each time I iterate through this for loop, I'll increment I by 1 each time, and I'll close those parentheses. Now all I want to do right now is call console.log to see what happens if I pass I in as a parameter right now. When I run the program, I get a list of numbers from 0 to 8, and so far it looks alright, but I want to know what would happen if I actually wrap parentheses, or not parentheses, but curly braces around console.log. If I run the program again, I still get the same list of numbers. And now I'm curious, well, what would happen if I call console.log outside of the for loop and not inside of the for loop? Well, I get the same list of numbers. Well, when I run it this time, I get the number 9 only. So I'm curious what happened between the two different calls. Well, when console.log is being called inside of the for loop, it's being called each time I iterate through the for loop. So when I is set to 0, I call console.log and I display 0. When I is set to 1, I call console.log and I'm displaying 1, and so on until I get to I being set to 8. I call console.log and display 8. Well, that was a true condition. 8 is less than or equal to 8. That was true. I displayed console.log, but I also incremented 8 by 1, which turned the value for I into 9. So the next time I checked the condition, 9 is not less than or equal to 8, so I exited out of this for loop. So when I'm calling console.log outside of the for loop, what's happening is I'm only displaying that last value, that value 9 for I, and that's why I'm seeing 9 down below here. However, regardless of where I'm calling console.log, I'm starting to see a couple of things. The first thing is I'm not actually calling the right or correct value that I indicated I wanted earlier. I want an 8 by 8 grid. However, this is producing 9 different digits, not 8 different digits. Although I'm showing the values 0 through 8, I'm displaying those values, I'm getting 9 different digits. If I actually count them up, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 digits on display. I need to cut that down by 1, and that's pretty simple. I'm just going to get rid of that equal symbol, that sign there. Now when I call console.log from inside of the for loop, I'm just going to comment that out and run the program. Well, I only see the numbers 0 through 7. However, I do have 8 different digits being displayed. And if I were to actually call it from outside of the for loop, I can run the program again, and I see I have 8 as my final value. So 8 different digits are actually being displayed here. Okay, so now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to get rid of console.log from inside of the for loop, and I want to start thinking about, well, why am I displaying digits right now? Because I really want to display either empty spaces or hashtags. So in order to do that, I need to create an if statement. So I'm going to say if some condition is true, then I'll display something else. If it's not true, I'll display something else below. And the things that I'm going to display, I'm going to create some comments. I want to display either a string that's an empty space, or I want to display a string that is a hashtag. Okay. Now, one other thing I can do here is I can create some curly braces, which I think I'm going to do now. However, if I have the ability to, I'll get rid of them later. The nice thing about having them in now is, and if I get used to the habit of putting them in, then I'm building consistency of being known, just always knowing I always have these curly braces here, and if I ever need to put them in the future, I don't have to do that because I already have that habit built. Okay, but now I need to think about this condition. So if this statement's true, I want to produce an empty space. Well, if I think about this at the bottom, what I'm going to do real quick is start trying to display a visual of what I'm wanting. I'm either wanting a space or a hashtag displayed. A space or a hashtag. Space or hashtag. Well, the first time I is set in the for loop, it's set to 0. So it starts at a value of 0, and I can think about that as my first space inside my list of strings. Well, when I is at 0, I have an empty space. However, when I is at 1, I want to display a hashtag. And when I moves on to 2, I want to display an empty space. And when I moves on to 3, I want to display another hashtag. So what I'm really looking at is even and odd numbers. So if I is 0, it's an even number. If I is 1, it's odd. If it's at 2, it's even. If it's at 3, it's odd. If it's at 4, it's even, and I'll display that empty space. If it's at 5, it's odd, and I'll display a hashtag. So whenever I'm at an even number, I want to display an empty space, and odd numbers will display a hashtag. So that's how I'm going to build my if condition here. So if my value for I, if I can divide that by 2 and get a remainder of 0, then it's an even number. And the way I can check that is by using the remainder symbol, or that modulo symbol. As long as the remainder is equal to 0, then it's divisible by 2. But however, I'm really saying I'm looking at an even number. If this isn't a true condition, I'm going to skip over what's ever inside parentheses below and move on to the else statement and display what's ever set inside of those curly braces below. So now I just need to start thinking about how I can get those strings to be displayed. Now I'm going to do this incorrectly at first. I'm going to set a variable, and I'm going to name that variable board because I'm building a chessboard here. Okay, so its name is board, and I'm going to set it equal to an empty space and close off that statement. However, if I'm working with odd numbers, I don't want an empty space, I want a hashtag, so I'm going to redefine a variable. I'm going to name it board, and on the board I want to put this hashtag. Well, what would happen if I ran it now? Would I get these empty spaces and hashtags? Well, I'm going to click run, and no, I'm still getting the number 8. So what happened? Well, if I look at console.log, I'm still passing I in as a parameter. I is related to the values. I need to pass board in as a parameter because board is my string. So I'm going to get rid of I. I'll pass board in as the parameter and run the program. And this time I'm getting a hashtag. And I'm curious, why didn't I get a string of empty spaces and hashtags? Well, this for loop is calling an if statement each time I iterate through the for loop. But each time I do that, I'm redefining board each time. So if it's an even number, if I started at an even number, I'm defining board, but then if my next number for I is an odd number, I'm redefining that odd number or board to be a hashtag. So I'm not producing a string of empty spaces and hashtags. I'm just redefining board each time. Therefore, I need to find a way to concatenate these as a string. I need to build a string somehow using these even and odd numbers. All right, well, let's think about this. The last number I was on, the last number I landed on here, so when I was set to 0 that first time through, I was set to 0. Well, I ran into my if statement here, and since I is set to 0, 0 has a remainder of 0 when I divide by 2. Therefore, board was set to an empty space. However, I incremented I by 1. I moved on to the value 1, and now, since 1 is an odd number, it's not divisible by 2, it has a remainder after it that's not equal to 0. Therefore, board was redefined and it was set to a hashtag, and it kept going back and forth, setting board to either an empty string or hashtags based off the number I was on inside of the for loop. Well, the last number it landed on was 7. 7 is an odd number, so board was set to a hashtag, and that's why I'm seeing a hashtag here in my display or my window. So rather than defining board inside of the if statement, or rather than redefining it each time, what I want to do is define it outside of that for loop altogether. So I'm going to set my variable name, board, equal to nothing, a string that has nothing inside of it, and I'll close that statement. Now if I actually run through this program again, I want to know, is this going to produce the string that I'm interested in? So when I click run, well, no, it's not. It's actually creating that same hashtag from the first time. That's because although I've defined board outside of the for loop, I am changing the value of board each time I iterate through the for loop, depending on whether I'm on an even number or an odd number, again, whether I is set to an even or an odd number. So rather than resetting the value for board, I want to concatenate this string onto the variable name board, which happens to be empty at the start. So to do that, I'm going to just put an addition symbol in front of the equal symbol each time. So I'm concatenating that string onto that empty string from before. So now when I run through the program, I should get, in fact, I'm getting a syntax error, but if I close out of that, when I run through it, I should get that list or that string of empty spaces and hashtags. Great, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4 empty strings and 1, 2, 3, 4 hashtags. So now I'm on the right track, but I want to start thinking about, why is my grid not moving downward? I don't really have a chessboard look. I only have one list of empty strings and hashtags. Why is my grid not moving downward? Well, I've only defined my for loop in one direction, a horizontal direction. In fact, I'm creating a grid here, and when I think about math, when I think about grids, I think about coordinate planes. Coordinate planes have an x and a y axis. Right now, I've only defined the horizontal axis, that x-axis. So what I'm going to do is change this variable I to x, because x represents the x-axis, or that horizontal direction of movement. So now each I has been replaced. When I run the program again, I should get the same string, and I did. But now I need to start thinking about, okay, I've moved in a horizontal direction. Now I need to move in a vertical direction. I need to move in the y direction. So to do this, I'm going to create another for loop. So for, and I'm going to name this variable I, that counter variable will be not I said I, but I meant y, because I'm moving in a different direction, a vertical direction. I'll set it equal to 0, and now I'm going to say I is less than 8, and I'll increment y by 1 each time. And I think I've said I a couple times, but I just want to make sure I'm meaning the variable y, that variable name y. Okay, so now I'll open up my curly braces, but before I close them, I need to think about where that ending curly brace will go. Now when I was working with this first for loop, or that first block of code, I created one string of empty spaces and hashtags. But now I'm going to move downward from there. So the y direction is going to help me do that. All I have to do is, each time I iterate through this for loop for the y direction, I'm just going to move down one line, and I'm going to wrap the entire block of code for the second for loop, that x for loop, I guess we could call it. I'm going to set that inside of the for loop for my y direction. So all I really have to do is move down a new line each time I iterate through y. Alright, so to do that, I'm just going to concatenate a new line onto board each time. I'm going to talk about that now. So what's happening inside of the entire block of code? Well, when I start out here, y is set to 0. So y is set to 0, and when it's set to 0, it's going to run into a for loop. That for loop will create a string. It's going to create a string of empty spaces and hashtags, and it's going to do that as long as x is less than 8. Once it finds out it's equal to 8 or greater, it's going to exit out. I'm going to move down a line, and now the value of y will increment by 1. So I'll move down one line, and I'll run into the for loop again for the x for loop, and I'll run through that block of code again, creating a new string of empty spaces and hashtags. Well, let's see what happens when I do this. Alright, now I'm getting a grid. However, it's not really looking like a chessboard. I mean, all of my empty spaces are in line with one another. All of my hashtags are in line with one another. And I actually want them to alternate back and forth. So in order to do this, one thing I'm going to do for now is set board. I'm going to concatenate one more thing on the board. I'm going to display, in fact, let's say this, board, I want to concatenate y onto it. I want to see just what the value of y is each time I move down a line. I think that will help me display this a little bit better. So if I run the program again, alright, I'm seeing that, well, when y is set to 0, I'm getting a string for my x values. When y is set to 1, when I iterate through the for loop again, I'm producing another string that's equivalent to the string before it. And like I said, I want to alternate through this. So in order to do that, what I really want to do is look at this space right here. Once I move down, once y is set to 1, and I move to this first space on this next line, the second line, well, y is set to 1. However, x is set to 0, and that's that first space there. And that space right there, when x is set to 0, I actually want to have a hashtag, not an empty space. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is move to my if statement inside of that condition and say, well, if it's an even number, I want an empty space. If it's an odd number, I want a hashtag. But to check this condition, what I can do is kind of alter this some. So when I'm on even lines, not when I'm on x being an even number, but when I is on a line that's set to an even number, I could actually add that value to x and still produce an even number. Even plus even gives me an even number. So what I'm going to do from here is go into this if statement and look at what can I do to change this slightly. Well, remember, y is set to 1, x is set to 0. So if I actually add those two together, I'll get an odd number. If I add 1 to 0, I'll get an odd number, which would allow me to produce a hashtag here. If I move down a line and y is set to 2 and add that to my x value, remember this first space for x is 0, it's always 0, well 2 plus 0 gives me an even number, I'll produce an empty space again. When I move down to y being set to 3, x set to 0, if I add these together, then I get an odd number, I'll get a hashtag again. So all I have to do is go into this condition and just add y and x together. So now when I run through the program, I'm going to run through the program again. I'll get the chessboard that I'm wanting, or should, and I can talk about what's happening each time. So the first time I run through the for loop, y is set to 0, and in this first space, x is set to 0. So in this condition, it's saying, well, x is 0, and y is 0. When I add them together, they're an even number, or an even sum. That gives me a remainder of 0 when I divide it by 2. Therefore, I'll put down an empty string. And I'll run through that entire block of code for the first line. Now, when I move down a line, because I've exited out of that block of code, I'm going to run back up to my for loop for y. Y will be set to 1. I'm on my next line now. Y is set to 1, but x is set to 0 right here. So when I add 0 for x to y for 1, when I add those two values together, well, 0 plus 1 gives me 1. When I divide that by 2, the remainder is not 0. It's not true, therefore I won't produce this string. I'll skip over to the else statement and produce a hashtag, and that's what's happened. It's going back and forth. I'll produce this entire line of code. I'll run through this block. Once that block's run out, I'll move down a line and I'll run through the for loop again. I'll increment y by 1. Y will be set to 2. In this position, x is set to 0. When I add 0 for my x value to 2 for my y value, I get an even number. Even numbers allow me to run this first block of code, and I'll create a new line or string of empty spaces and hashtags, and it will allow me to create my entire chessboard. Now, one thing I'm wanting to do is get rid of that statement right there. I don't want to have the numbers in front of my chessboard each time I move down a line. That was just for show. So when I run the program, now I'm just getting my chessboard without any numbers in front of it. But I've got to go back to one of my last goals. I wanted to define a variable, and I was going to call it or name it size and set it equal to 8. Well, where's all that coming from? Well, if I look at both for loops right here, my conditions for both for loops, I'm saying that y is less than 8, x is less than 8, and if I ever want to change any of that, I've got to do it separately, one by one. And if this is something I'm not wanting to do, I'm wanting to save time or not wanting to have to rewrite code, then what I can do is set a variable. In this case, I'm going to name it size. I'm going to set it equal to 8. I can set this variable in place of those values instead of having to rewrite those values in multiple places. Now I have them stored in one place, and if I want to change the size of my x and y grid, what I can do is just change that value in one place. So and I'm going to run this code, I still get the same grid below. However, if I want to change the size of that grid, let's say a 9 by 9 grid now, I can run my code again, and now I have a chessboard. It would be a 9 by 9 chessboard, so now I have 9 characters running across and 9 characters running down. And if I wanted to be a little bit more adventurous, I could say 12, a 12 by 12, or a 64 by 64 grid chessboard. Okay, so now I'm just going to set it back to 8, create my chessboard, and that is it. Okay, so earlier I stated, you know what, these curly braces are good for consistency, but if you want to be more brief, if you only have one thing to do with inside of your if statement, then you can get rid of those curly braces. So I'm going to get rid of that comment below also and that curly brace. I'm going to delete it, and I'm going to remove that second curly brace, that closing curly brace, and for the else statement I'm going to do the same thing. Get rid of the curly brace that opens the statement or the condition, and get rid of the comment. And then I'm going to get rid of that curly brace that closes it. And hopefully when I run through this now, I should get the same display over here, but with less code, it's a little bit more clean. In fact, I'm just going to clean that up one last bit and run the program. I get the same grid here. It's 9 characters long, and I'm iterating through it. Or it's 8 characters long, and I'm iterating through it 8 different times. Cool.